Hi, all you sci-fi and fantasy lovers out there. I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of iWizard, a community I'm starting that will be devoted to fantasy and sci-fi literature. So I just finished a book that I really enjoyed, and that is Dauntless, the first book in Jack Campbell's The Lost Fleet series. I'm really excited to talk with you about it, and roll the intro. Welcome back to iWizard. This is a new channel, and so I guess I'll say now that all of my reviews are going to be what I like to call mostly non-spoiler reviews, including this one. In other words, different people have differing opinions as to what counts as a spoiler and what counts as non-spoiler, and I want to be able to give enough information about the book that I'm reviewing to give you a sense of it. So at times I may encroach the tiniest bit into spoiler territory, but I promise I will never spoil anything major. I just like to give a little bit more detail than what some of the booktubers do when they say they're going to give you a non-spoiler review. Oftentimes it's very vague. I'd like to be able to, without spoiling anything, do a kind of full-throated review of each of the books that I'm covering. So Dauntless is the first book in Jack Campbell's The Lost Fleet series. It was published in 2006, but the series, as you can see, has expanded and now includes spin-offs and offshoots. So if you end up loving Dauntless, there's a whole world for you to explore and live in. I know I enjoyed this first book so much that I'm sure that in the future I'll be wanting to pick up future books in this series. It's a very readable series, and Jack Campbell is a really good military sci-fi writer. So let's start with the genre then. This book is military sci-fi, or some people might call it space fleet sci-fi, though unlike some space fleet sci-fi, it's not so much a soap opera in space as it is a very hard-nosed tactical military adventure story. So if you were looking for Star Trek or Firefly or Babylon 5 or Battlestar Galactica, that's not really what this is. Although of the shows I just mentioned, it is probably most like Battlestar Galactica. Let's get in then to what this book is all about. The plot is actually really cool. So you have two sides. You have the Alliance. These are basically the good guys. They care about representative democracy, human rights, civil liberties, and a kind of a government by the people and for the people, or at least that's what they say they're all about, right? Who knows if we can trust them? The Alliance, the good guys, are 100 years into a brutal and costly war with these syndics. These are the bad guys. The syndics are also humans, but they're basically a corrupt, oppressive, cutthroat corporate kleptocracy run by a ruthless CEO. So this is like a military fleet run by a ruthless CEO. We eventually learn that in this world, human beings are the only intelligent life forms known to exist, or so the Alliance believes. So at the very beginning, it becomes clear that the Alliance is losing the war. Their ships are beaten up, morale is low, the Alliance fleet is crippled. And at the very beginning of the book, they're stranded in enemy territory. So that's where we start. And their only hope is a man who has emerged from a century-long hibernation to find that he has been heroically idealized beyond belief. And this guy's name is Blackjack Geary. He is the hero and the main character of the story. I, for one, really liked Blackjack Geary as a character. He's not so much an anti-hero as a reluctant hero, someone who's trying to figure out who he is and whether or not he should be occupying a leadership position. So this guy, Blackjack Geary, was in a firefight out in space 100 years ago at the very beginning of the war. This war has been going on for a century. And he is famous for having sacrificed himself. He took enemy fire, he held off the Syndics, and he allowed all the other ships in his fleet to escape. He went out like a hero. He performed these heroic maneuvers and he saved the day. Then, right before his ship exploded, he went into an escape hibernation pod, and somehow, 100 years later, the ship Dauntless, of the eponymous title here, um, the ship Dauntless from the Alliance fleet found Geary's hibernation pod, picked him up, and regenerated him. So they found him floating around in space. If they hadn't found him when they did, he would have died in a few years after they found him. So everyone is shocked that he's back. For the past 100 years or so, they'd thought he was dead, and they turned him into this kind of hero, this savior of the Republic type. School children learned about the heroic Captain Geary. They grew up saying his lines, learning to memorize the words that he said in his final days. And so they've made him this kind of demigod. So that's the plot. That's how this book begins. Blackjack Geary is on this ship, and I won't spoil anything here, but once he recovers from his deep hibernation, once he thaws out, something happens, and he ends up taking command of the entire fleet. He has to. And when he does, the fleet is trapped in Syndic territory. So they're trapped. The old leaders are gone. I won't tell you how. And Blackjack Geary, this hero that everyone had thought long dead for the last 100 years, is suddenly in control of the entire Alliance fleet. Now, he's a hero of the Alliance, so most people go along with this. But of course, like any good story, there are people who think Geary is out of touch or unqualified. Some of them don't believe he is who he says he is, or think that the long hibernation process has hollowed him out. But he's been put in charge nonetheless. And when he takes command, he's immediately thrust into action, and he has to get the fleet out of Syndic territory. They're stuck. They're too beaten up and vulnerable to win this fight. So Geary's first challenge, after being frozen for 100 years, is to take charge and make a bold escape and get his fleet out of harm's way. And so basically, that's what the book is about. You spend the whole rest of the book following the fleet as they make one escape after another, and the story basically becomes a long and exciting chase with periods of tension and drama, but also downtime and rest. And so it's basically that archetypal stress and release pattern with lots and lots of strategy and military politics. This is like a chess game played out in space. There are also some embedded mysteries that Campbell saves for the latter books in the series. And I guess you could say the whole story in this first book, Dauntless, is not just how Geary is going to get his fleet where they need to go, but how he is also going to rebuild the Alliance, which has become super decadent since he's been in this hibernation pod. 100 years ago, the Alliance was noble and heroic. They had elaborate rules of engagement and rules of warfare and international sort of human rights norms and things like that. And after 100 years of fighting, basically all of the young officers in charge have forgotten all of this. And eventually you realize that the whole story in this first book is not just how Geary is going to get his fleet where they need to go, but how is he going to rebuild the Alliance, which is only a shell of what it once was. The protagonist, the main hero, is also trying to figure out who he is. Is he the same guy who sacrificed himself all those years ago? We learn that Blackjack Geary is not a perfect man. He has a shadowy past. He's made some mistakes in his life. He isn't perfect. And so he's kind of trying to do better, I guess you could say. So this guy is searching for redemption. He wants to do better this time. He wants to get his fleet out of trouble. He wants to rebuild the Alliance, and he's kind of on a mission. One of the cool things about this book is the situation that our hero has inherited. It's kind of like the island of Ithaca in Homer's Odyssey. When Odysseus leaves for Troy in Homer's Odyssey, he leaves with all the other fighting age men of Ithaca. And as a result, the young men who are left on the island of Ithaca over the next 10 to 20 years are raised without fathers. Most of the men on the island are young. Many of them are arrogant. They're harassing Penelope and Telemachus, Odysseus's son. They're eating all their food. They're behaving really badly. And so when Odysseus finally sails back over the wine dark seas to Ithaca after 20 or so years, he has to whip them into shape. Actually, he kills many of them. And it's kind of a parallel to what happens in this book. It's kind of the same for Blackjack Geary. In Dauntless, war has been raging for a century. So everyone with any experience is already dead. So Geary has to take over this fleet that is composed of all of these young officers who are talented and patriotic, but they're also arrogant and they don't have very much experience. And he really has to whip them into shape and train them and teach them about battle strategy. So those scenes in the book are really cool. And so you would think they're young and arrogant, they would resist Blackjack Geary's mentorship, but you have to remember, they were raised believing that Blackjack Geary was this legendary hero of the Republic. And so most of these young people have a tremendous respect for him, but they lack discipline, they lack experience. And so, again, I would say another interesting theme that runs throughout this book is that Commander Geary is surprised at how decadent and amoral the Alliance fleet has become. They seem to have no compunctions against killing civilians, blowing up anything that gets in their way, leaving other members of the fleet behind, maltreating prisoners, and that sort of thing. And Geary is kind of shocked, actually, that nobody cares. Back in my day, people cared about that sort of thing. People did not want to maltreat prisoners, and the Alliance used to be so great. And Geary is just kind of shocked that nobody cares about these ethical norms. All they care about is winning. And so one of the main themes of this book is that when you've been fighting the enemy for such a long time, you begin to dehumanize the enemy. You begin to dehumanize your opponent, or as co-president Rion says, she's this Laura Roslin-like character. She says the pressures of this war have warped those who fight it. And so it reminds you of that famous Nietzsche quote. See if I can remember it. He who fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And that is one of the major themes in this book. So one of the positives of this book, I would say, is that it's not just a sort of nerdy military sci-fi book. It's got all sorts of ethical questions that Campbell raises. What are the ethical implications of war? How should a military treat its enemies? When is it right to use force? And when is the use of force unethical? What is the difference between an honest mistake and a war crime? Should AI be used in war? Should artificial intelligence ships be used in war? Or could that backfire? Would your enemy be able to hack into that ship and turn it against you? Should the commander of a fleet have an override button to control all of the other ships in his fleet? Or would that erode trust? Or would that also would that give the Syndics a tactical advantage? Because if they could control one ship, if they could just take over the Dauntless, they could control all the other ships. So it has all of these military strategy questions, ethical questions. And that's one of the things that I was really surprised by, is that this is not just a wham, bang, sort of slapdash military sci-fi book. There's actually a deeper moral message here. And so that's basically what the book is about. Once Captain Geary overcomes that first trial that he's placed into at the beginning of the book, where he has to escape Syndic territory and find this ingenious way to escape, which no one had thought of. When he takes over, he begins to accept his position as a leader. He begins to think like a leader. So another theme in this book is leadership. How do you, what does leadership mean? How do you improve morale among your troops, among your soldiers, among your fleet? How do you, win wars while making sure that you do your ancestors proud? That's a big theme in this book, is everyone's always trying to figure out what would make their ancestors proud. And so Commander Blackjack Geary is on a mission to turn these boys into men, to fix the ships. Actually, it's not just men, it's men and women. Like probably almost half of the officers in this book are women. And so all of that is good stuff in this book. One of the other things that I like about this story, and it may just be my sort of Battlestar Galactica nostalgia, one of the things I like is that there's an enemy antagonist, obviously, in the story. The Syndics are the mortal enemy of the Alliance, but there's also a friend or ally antagonist. Captain Geary has basically a Laura Roslin, Madam President woman on board his ship who is constantly causing trouble for him, challenging him ethically and strategy wise, just like Roslin does for Adama. And so I really liked that. It never felt like it was derivative, but it felt like kind of an archetype there. And I really enjoyed the fact that there was not only an antagonist as the enemy, but there was also a friendly antagonist. So let's talk about some of the positives and negatives with this book. I thought Dauntless had an excellent blend of the personal journey of the protagonist, the relationships between crew members, the action scenes and the tactics and the battles and the overall drama of the Alliance and the situation that they got themselves in. The space battles are excellently done. Campbell has a real knack for describing space battles so that they're compelling and easy to follow. You always know what's going on. It's never confusing. The battle tactics and the scenarios Campbell traps the characters in, all of that is done really well. The whole book is like a giant game of chess. It's not very deep or intellectual, but in terms of sort of strategy and sort of just cerebral, like problem solving and strategizing and tactics, it's a brilliant book. By the way, Jack Campbell is actually the pen name of John G. Hemry. That's Hemry with an M, not with an N. Hemry himself is a retired U.S. Navy officer. I'm actually a military brat as well. Both of my parents were in the Navy as well. So I found that interesting. And you can really tell from reading this book that Hemry is a military man. He understands how military people talk to each other. He understands what leadership in action looks like. He understands military protocol and the chain of command and how it's actually really slow to turn ships around and things like that. And one of my favorite things about this book is that the protagonist gets thrust into a position of leadership that he didn't ask to be in. He did not expect to have to inhabit. He did not really want to occupy this position of leadership. And so when he's confronted with problems, Campbell, the author, really shows us what is going through Geary's mind, showing us what it feels like to inhabit a position of leadership under pressure and stress, the hard choices you have to make, the times when you have to swallow your pride and admit someone else is right, the times when you have to listen, the times when you have to actually do the other thing and talk and put your foot down and not listen. So I liked all of that. Campbell really understands leadership. Another thing I liked is that Campbell really pays attention to the limitations of humans in space, the vast distances. He's always talking about the fact that something will happen in space and your enemy doesn't find out about it for hours. The fact that the battlefield can sometimes be light years across. Here's another thing I really enjoyed about this and I thought was done brilliantly. Because the protagonist, because Blackjack Geary hasn't been active for a century, he doesn't fully know how to operate the ship. He doesn't know how to use all the new weapons, and he sometimes seems old-fashioned and out of touch. So there's a kind of dad-like quality about him that I found charming. And it means that he has to rely on his sidekick. There's an excellent sidekick character in this book, and it's this woman, Captain Desjani, Tanya Desjani, to be more precise. One of the cool effects here is that even a guy who has been in sleep hibernation for 100 years, I found it really interesting that it seemed like Jack Campbell was saying, even a guy who's been in hibernation for 100 years can keep up and thrive in whatever age because common sense is timeless. A chess mind is timeless. Sure, the fads have changed, the tech has changed, the morality has changed in terms of what people believe and what they think is right. The body mods and protocols have changed. But if Blackjack Geary can think on his feet and strategize a battle plan and take charge and use his critical thinking skills, he can still win the day. It doesn't matter if he's out of touch. If he can plan a battle, if he can delegate command better than anyone else, it really doesn't matter if he's been out of the game for 100 years. He's still the best man for the job. And I found that to be one of the most satisfying elements of the book. You can imagine, take someone from 1921 and transport them via time travel to 2021. Sure, there'd be culture shock. Sure, they would be amazed at all of the technological marvels. They'd be amazed at the way these young kids talk these days. They'd be amazed at how everything has changed. But if you take a really competent, driven, smart person who has common sense from 1921, they're still going to succeed in 2021. And so I think that's another one of the main messages of this story is that smarts are timeless. Common sense is timeless. Morality, what's truly right, is timeless. You have this guy in this story, this main character, who comes back from 100 years in the past and is teaching these young kids that they're being unethical in war. So there's a kind of an old guy satisfaction, a kind of nostalgic quality about this book as well. But at the same time, the main character is always being thrust into situations in which he has to deal with younger characters. His sidekick, Captain Desjani, is she's a woman of her age, and she's a great sidekick too. She's not afraid to challenge Blackjack Geary. But she also really respects him, and she respects the chain of command. She respects military discipline. In some ways, she's even more disciplined than he is, but she's a product of her culture. And so you really have this really nice mentor-mentee relationship in the book where Captain Geary is constantly trying to teach. I keep calling him Captain. It's Commander Geary is always trying to teach Captain Desjani. Captain Desjani is captain of Dauntless. Blackjack Geary is the commander of the entire Alliance fleet, and he is also on Dauntless. That's sort of his home base with Desjani. Just to be clear about that. So those are the positives. There are all sorts of cool weapons, cool battles. There's these null field weapons which destroy matter. There's all sorts of great tactical scenes, drama between the officers. And is there going to be a mutiny? Are they going to try to overthrow? Are they going to try to undermine the protagonist's authority and all of this stuff? So there's a lot of stuff that I liked, much more that I liked than I disliked. But there are a few negatives that I want to point out. They definitely don't ruin the story, and they're probably kind of nitpicky things, but there are a few things I didn't like about this book and that I thought I would just mention. I felt like at some points in the book, the characters were very disembodied. A lot of times it felt like the characters were like Blackjack Geary was just controlling the entire fleet from his mind. He's kind of like a brain in a vat, right? He's just this like floating intellect. I really feel like the characters should have been more embodied. A lot of times it just felt like these abstract space battles being narrated from the perspective of this one character. And it just felt like these were floating intellects in space. And I think in space, it's even more important in hard sci-fi, space opera, military sci-fi, that you embody the characters, you make them feel like real human beings that are stuck in a tired, exhausted body. There were many points in this book where I wasn't even sure where the characters were. I think they were on the bridge, but it wasn't clear. Is he interacting with a screen here? Is he pulling a lever here? What is he doing? You just get this abstract sense that the ship is moving wherever Geary wants it to go. And there's this whole sort of man behind the curtain aspect of it that I didn't really, that at times I felt was a bit of a drawback. Some of the dialogue is unrealistic. Blackjack Geary would tell another officer what's what. And instead of arguing back, or instead of saying, thank you, sir, yes, sir, or whatever, they would say, oh, I see your wisdom and I understand your wisdom, right? He would say something like, we have to pay attention to the rules of war. It would make our ancestors proud. And then Johnny would say, oh, I see. Our ancestors would be proud that we're following the rules of war. And they would just repeat what Blackjack Geary said with this kind of obsequious, kind of sycophantic reverence. And then there were also characters that weren't sycophantic and that were totally against Blackjack Geary, and they were a bit cartoonish as well. But on the main, the characters were well drawn. The dialogue was good on the main, but at times you could really tell a kind of nerdy military man was writing the dialogue. Let me go over a couple of things that I think are just kind of personal peccadillos, personal sort of preferences, things that I prefer to see in a sci-fi book. I would have liked to have seen a bit more sort of crew and ship drama. I would have appreciated a larger cast, more sort of crew hijinks, more bonding, more of an intimate feel between a team of military personnel. I really do like the Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, Firefly, Star Trek formula of a fleet. They get in trouble together. They have intimate conversations together. Sometimes there are romances and things like that. It really did feel like a bunch of space battles without the kind of character building that you need to make it feel like the space battles are something I should be concerned about. It would have been more on the edge of my seat if I had a better sense of all of the characters involved. It seemed like sometimes a ship would be blown up and we'd lose a bunch of characters and I didn't even know them, so it didn't really matter. And I would have liked to have also seen more culture and politics, more of a sense of what it's like in the future, what human civilization has turned into, what are the different religions, what are the different homeworlds like, and things like that. It really did feel like it was a little bit lacking in the culture department. And I would say that the last thing, and again, it's just a personal preference here, that I didn't like was that I feel like there should be some constraints, especially with hard sci-fi. What was it that Robert Frost said? Poetry without rules is like playing tennis without a net. There were times where I felt like Jack Campbell was playing tennis without a net. There are two different forms of faster than light speed travel. I would have liked to have seen more constraint. I tend to like space opera that doesn't have faster than light speed travel. I don't really see how that's possible. Nor does Jack Campbell ever make any attempt to explain how that came to be, right? If you read something like Alistair Reynolds, you have the conjoiner drives. Anyways, I really just would have preferred that there wasn't faster than light speed travel. There were these jump points that allow you to travel faster than light speed. There's a hypernet that allows you to travel faster than light speed, and it was never really explained how that worked. And so it kind of it kind of didn't, I didn't have that suspension of disbelief. But overall, I loved this book. People say this all the time. Oh, I was up all night turning pages. I couldn't go to bed because I was turning pages. I really did feel like this. It was hard to put down. It was hard to stop reading. You really are on the edge of your seat with this book. This is solid military science fiction, and I had a really good time with it. And I would recommend it to any fans of hard sci-fi and or military sci-fi and or space fleet sci-fi. If you like that kind of thing, give Jack Campbell a try. There's like 20 books in the series now. The guy's a really prolific writer. And so, okay, now let us turn to our ranking of Dauntless by Jack Campbell.
Okay, so let's quickly go over my ranking system here. I like to break each book down into several criteria, 5 to be precise: story or plot, characters, that would be the character development, how well realized and compelling are the characters, prose, so how eloquent and beautiful is the writing? Is it psychologically penetrating? Is it possessed of what Harold Bloom called cognitive power? Is the prose deep and highly original? Then there's originality itself. So is the work original? So for example, there are many books that I don't think are very original in terms of their conception, their full realization. Something like Christopher Rocchio's series, the Solon Empire, the one that starts with Empire of Silence. It's not a very original series. It reminds me very much of Dune, but I love that series nonetheless. So that might get lower on originality, but very high on prose and character and story and things like that. So, and then there's world building. That is, with fantasy and sci-fi, world building matters a lot. I appreciate good, conscientious world building. And then there's an overall score. So let's start with the story. The plot was excellent in Dauntless. I loved it. I was really impressed. It was a page turner. The entire thing was this high octane, high speed chase throughout space, culminating in this epic space battle. So the story gets a 90. Okay. How about the characters? The characters were an 85. You really get inside the head of Captain Blackjack Geary. He's an interesting, compelling main protagonist. He is nuanced. There's a depth to him. He's very introspective. I liked him, but I felt like the other characters, especially Desjani and Rion, the Laura Roslin-like character, as well as the enemy Syndic fleet, I felt like the other characters and some of the other officers just weren't that well developed. So the character work was good. I'm giving it an 85. Okay, and then there's the prose. The prose was average military sci-fi written by a military man. It was serviceable. It was competent. But it never rose. I never underlined something and went, wow, that sentence bowled me away. I'm just amazed by what this man just wrote. It never reached the sort of level of real beauty or anything like that. So the prose was very average, but I was almost never distracting. Originality, I give that a 90. Just because the space battles were so original. I feel like the main conceit of the plot of a long lost hero who school children have learned about, who's been lost for 100 years in a hibernation pod, is randomly picked up by the Dauntless fleet, and he's picked up just in time for him to take over the fleet and save the day. I thought that was brilliant and very effective. The world building was an 85. Yeah, I probably could have gone a little bit lower on that, but I truly feel like the future books are going to do more world building. They did go on a couple of different planets. Some of them, Rion and Geary himself gave their backstories. The ships were pretty well described. the weapons that were being used, the level of technology. So there was decent world building for a first kind of setup book. I would have liked to have seen more. The world building was pretty good, but not amazing. So I give that a solid B there. And that adds up to an 84 overall. So I was really impressed by this book. I loved it. I would recommend it to anyone. This is a solid debut book. I hope you didn't feel like my overall ranking was too harsh. An 84 is very good for me. I am a teacher after all. So Mr. Jack Campbell, Mr. John G. Henry gets an 84, an excellent debut military sci-fi book. I absolutely loved it, and I couldn't stop reading it. I probably finished this in 2 days, and I just had a great time with this book, and I would recommend it to all of my new listeners. So thank you for tuning in. Please click the subscribe button and support this channel. I really appreciate you joining me on my adventure to review the best of fantasy and sci-fi literature. All right, take care. Happy reading.